Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Royal Society of Victoria, especially those who've never been here before. My name is Peter Baines and I'm the Secretary, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this evening's meeting, which is joint with Amos, which I've had a long relationship with as well. In fact, I claim to be the first, or effectively the first, president of Amos, but we don't have to make much out of that. I'd like to acknowledge first that we are gathered here on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders past and present. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Gillian Sparks, who has been a prominent feature in the meeting that we've had here today on environmental sustainability. Gillian has a PhD in chemistry, and she spent the first part of her career with BHP. But since 1914, she's been the role of Victorian Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, and she's been recognised by both sides of Parliament, which is something of an achievement these days, I think, in some respects. She's just producing, or about to produce, a report. She's circulated an interim report, which is done every 4 years. The final report will be finalised later this year, but she can say a bit more about that. And that is basically the topic of her talk. It's about the Victorian State of Environmental Report. Gillian.
Thanks, Peter. I do feel old some days, but I was actually appointed in 2014, not 1914. I've got the bio oil going, so, my skin's doing well, but I'm so grateful to come here tonight. And thank you all for giving up your Friday night. Big hands for you. End of the week, walking past the cafes and the European and Spring Street, I thought, gee, I wonder if anyone will turn up. But actually, they did. And not only did they turn up, I've got half of my family here, a friend up the back, and lots of familiar faces. So I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you very much. Can I also please acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the people of the Wurundjeri, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we did have a forum here today which Uncle Ron, a Wurundjeri man, opened, and he said something so profound that I just loved, and I said to him, can I share this with the audience tonight, because it actually puts meaning to the work that we do and why we're here actually. He just said that the difference with us traditional owners is the country owns us, we don't own the country. European settlers think they own the country, and that's not the way it is. You need to turn it around and you'll manage it differently. And it was just a lovely way to start the day. So that's from Uncle Ron. He said share it for sure. Now, State of the Environment reporting after a few drinks on a Friday night I thought would be reasonably exciting. But I thought I'd just make it a bit more exciting by talking a little bit about who's going to read it anyway. What are they going to do with this thing? I think it's really important that we understand as scientists and communicators that it's not enough to do the work. We need the uptake, we need the impact from the work, and we need to make sure that the recommendations that we make are being adopted. So the first part of my speech tonight talks a little bit about getting things done in government and what we've done to make sure that the report lands on fertile ground. We're running out of time to do some of the things we think need to be done as environmental scientists, and we need the report to land on fertile ground. So we are independent scientific reporters. In my office I've got a small team but high impact. 4 science writers and a whole team of 7, and we punch above our weight and we collaborate across government, work very hard to make sure that all of our work is well consulted and well received and well understood when it lands. So I did want to just mention my role, because some people, like me, if I wasn't in this role, might say, well, what is the role? The role is a role that has its own act. It's appointed under the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability Act, and it's the only act that actually in the Victorian legislature that defines ecologically sustainable development, has objectives for the Commissioner and accountabilities of the Commissioner. So if you did want to have a look at it, go to it. It's actually a good act. One of the important things is, as I said, what is ecologically sustainable development? We're starting to see that those theories and the planning around this coming into more of our planning for, say, Infrastructure Victoria and things like that. So the importance of having that in my act is actually important for other people working across government and elsewhere. But one of the really interesting things, the Commissioner was formed in 2003. I'm the third Commissioner for Victoria, and there's been 2 State of the Environment reports produced by previous Commissioners. There's a report produced every 5 years. It's in the Act that we must produce it every 5 years, and this one will be due on the 28th of November. One of the things about the role was that we have 7B in the Act says that we need to encourage decision making that facilitates ecologically sustainable development, which is a grand idea, but actually how do you do that? You know, we put our minds to what does that mean and how do we do that? And what are the frameworks that we can use to help us do that? Luckily, in 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were ratified. And so what we're doing, and I'm not going to talk about, this is a whole method in this, but what we're doing, as well as doing the report on the biophysical health of the environment, this cycle, we're spending a lot of time mapping our State of the Environment reporting indicators to Sustainable Development Goal targets so that when we go forward in 2019 for the next round, we will have done the work behind the scenes, if you like, to start saying, if we were to report against the Sustainable Development Goals, if I was to do that as a Commissioner on the health of the environment, what targets would I use? And that will include not only the biophysical health of the environment, but also socioeconomic, which is, you know, so important. Without a healthy environment, we don't have good health. So for those people who are interested in the SDGs, and even if you're not, I want you to read the report, but even if you don't, have a look at this work because apparently it's the only work, according to the guys who work with the UN, it's the only work that's actually looking at how we systemically change the system to monitor and report against the SDGs rather than traditional report cards against the SDGs, which at the moment are just sort of putting a layer over our existing system. We're actually hardwiring it to rewire the system. So it's worth having a look at it. That's me, because I like it, but I think it is. So when I was appointed in 2014, as I said, one of the really important things about the work that we do in the office, A, is that it doesn't cost too much. B, is that you get great impact and good public value. And part of that is that we must inform policy and practice at state level. At the very least, that's what we must do. So in 2014, I was appointed and asked to do a review of the impact of State of the Environment reporting and did quite a comprehensive review and confirmed that there was a lot of appetite for State of the Environment reports by policymakers, but they weren't able to use the work in the form that it was produced as much as they'd like to. There was a long list of things that were required of me as Commissioner if I was to be successful with this, but this led us on a journey of reform, and it's the journey of reform that's in line with Europe, which started earlier than us. In 2005, the European Environment Agency did what we did in terms of old-style State of the Environment reporting, science reports for scientists, I call it. You know, sort of, it's really great, but it's hard to read if you're not a scientist. In 2010, the European Environment Agency moved to Outlook reporting. We do Outlook reporting in Australia, for example, for the Great Barrier Reef and things like that. We're moving towards that, but we're focusing on the systemic challenges. So the takeaway is the review said we need to be a lot more acute in how we develop recommendations and also look to solution. How would we implement them? And that's what we're doing. Really fantastic work, I have to say, in addition to the work we're doing on the state of the environment. So I want to leave you with a positive feeling that there's a lot of great work going on, a lot of really good things being done. I feel very confident that we're going forward, and we just need to keep going and go faster. But the major environmental policy and portfolio reforms in the last few years, water plans, biodiversity plans, we had the fantastic with the Wurundjeri people in Parliament. I don't know if people saw that with the Yarra Protection Act. One of my colleagues is here tonight, Dr. Rebecca Koss, is drafting the first ever State of the Yarra and its Parklands report. So we've got the policy frameworks, and I'll speak about that a bit more in a moment, but we've got heaps of things that we can use and work with. Now, just before I go on to the report, because one of the problems with State of the Environment reporting is it can get caught in the politics. And people think, this environmental space can be seen as a political area. I loved this quote that I'm a big fan of Audrey Zibelman, the CEO of AEMO. I don't know if anyone has followed Audrey's work. There was an article, opinion piece on her in one of the weekend papers last weekend. And they said something about energy policy and her work being so political, and she just said, my personal feelings have nothing to do with the job I've been asked to do, which I just thought was fantastic. And for us, we know it's all about the science, right? We're not into the politics, we're not advocates, we're into getting great baseline science. So that's why I'm so pleased to be at the Royal Society tonight too, because I know that's what you're into. The other bit about our office and the work that we're doing, we're about the science, we're not about the politics. We don't just analyse the problem and talk about the problem, we talk about the solution. We're all about what recommendations can we make in this report that take us forward. If I'm the Minister or the Premier or anyone actually, it's one thing to know what the problem is, it's another thing to have some insight into how we might go forward in a way that's manageable, prioritised, and the budgetary impact is thought through, which can be an issue with science reports if they're not thinking about the budgetary priorities. So when we did the report, the review rather, I just put this up because when I was asked about what do people want out of the report if they're going to use it for policy, and how would they like us to pitch? I love this saying with the NEG recently, although I know we don't want to talk about that and we don't love what's going on there, but security, reliable emissions reduction. If I hear one more time, we can't have all three, that's all I hear. You can have two, but you can't have three. Which two do you want? So what we say is, why can't we have everything? In our work, why can't we strive for what is the best? Why can't we try and do everything people want? Shift to digital, environmental accounts, baseline science, recommendations that are prioritised and budgeted. Why not? At the very beginning anyway, that's where we start. And if we backtrack from that, we backtrack. But we don't start by saying, pick the two you want. So the work that brought all of this thinking together is in what's called the State of the Environment Reporting Framework. Under my Act, 3 years before the report is due, which is 2018, November, I have to table a framework in the Victorian Parliament. So this framework was tabled in the Victorian Parliament in December 2015. It's a framework called State and Benefit because I wanted to start a conversation about the state of the environment, which sure, that's under the Act and that's what we do, but also the benefits. Who's talking about the benefits and who's talking about how Port Phillip Bay, and I'll talk a little bit about Port Phillip Bay in a minute, but Port Phillip Bay is clean. We've just done a State of the Bays report. We found that only 4 of 50 assessments across Port Phillip and Western Port showed any issues with indicators. That bay is home to Australia's busiest working port. The ecosystems are working really hard under the bay, keeping that bay clean, getting all the runoff from 75% of Melbourne's population lives around the bays. I mean, these things, we need to start accounting for that benefit in an economic sense. So there's a flavour of that through our work. This framework was different from normal ones, which are really about the science of the report. This framework sets out a reporting framework which is approved by Parliament, but I used it to get an authorisation from Parliament as a blueprint for reform. So it might have been a bit sneaky, but that's what we did. And we're so grateful that we were supported with that, because what it's done is given us an authorising environment to go forward and try new things, be really mindful of being efficient, but also effective and having impact. So after 2015, we've been working, the way we work across government has changed in that time, so we're much more collaborative, we work across government, but since we delivered that agenda for reform, if you like, the Commissioner now has more reports, actually 6 new reports in legislation that we never had before. So the reform's working in the sense that the office has reinvented itself. The value of science and underpinning good, objective science, good evidence bases and transparency for community in reports has really been a flavour coming through. So the Commissioner now has to deliver the State of the Marine and Coast, which will build on the 2016 State of the Bays. So that goes with the new Marine and Coastal Act. This is really good news. We should be very happy that we're now going to get independent reports on the state of Victoria's marine and coasts. It's initiated a whole lot of work on spatial mapping frameworks for marine, environment, coastal, looking at coastal mapping and all those things that you would think most people would be happy with. As I said, the State of the Yarra and its parklands report. We're doing the State of the Forest report, and of course the State of the Environment report. So we currently have 3 reports in production right now in the office, so we're really busy. And one of the really pleasing things is that the maturity of the portfolio has developed to the extent that we're moving also into giving the Commissioner performance reporting roles. So performance reporting is where the rubber hits the road. Did we do what we said we'd do, and has it had impact? So for the biodiversity, protecting Victoria's environment, the biodiversity plan, a great 20-year plan for the state. If you haven't looked at it, you should, because it's a 20-year plan and we'll deliver it over that period. The Commissioner needs to report on the targets. So as the agencies develop targets for plans for meeting targets and setting targets, we get to do independent reporting and say, yes, we did, excuse me, or no, we didn't. And that's, I think, for the democracy and the way we work to make sure we have access to this independent reporting is really important. The other work that's currently underway in the office is Action 3.6 in the water plan sets a role for the Commissioner to report on the benefits of environmental watering. Not too difficult, yes. We're actually scoping something and looking at the SDGs as a framework for that. So the SDGs are the go-to place now for us to think, how do we bring all these social, economic, environmental issues together and develop reports that really tell the whole story. So I call it reporting with impact and delivering reform in government. So just to wrap that up, the new governance arrangements and that co-design approach is improving the way our office works. We're getting improvement in the uptake of the science and how we work and how our work will be used across the environment portfolio. As I said, we've been referred for 6 new reporting functions. And for the Commissioner to be successful, we must influence policy and practice. And I feel very confident now that is happening, and there's an adaptive management cycle with our data custodians and others where we're actually all working together in a more symbiotic way. So that's just good news. Better information, better decisions, better outcomes. But the first project that we did under the new framework was the State of the Bays, and I just wanted to reinvigorate you with this before I talk a bit about the State of the Environment report.
I love fishing because it's a great way to meet people and have a good time basically. It's just a really good social thing as well as obviously it's entertaining when you're catching fish and getting a nice feed. My favourite fish to catch in Melbourne is the snapper. Out here I've caught fish sort of up to 6 to 7 kilos, which is great fun on light tackle. I think the bay's in really good health. You know, the reef systems and that fisheries are creating in the bay is a really good thing because it's a great habitat for fish.
When you speak to people that have been fishing for a long period of time, they actually recognise how important these habitats are. Yeah, you just chat to anyone about where you go fishing for the best spot. Usually it's in between, you know, the seagrass and the reef, and they'll tell you really specifically about the best places to fishing, and it's usually related to these habitats. We do a range of different work on a lot of the different habitats. So that might be diving out in the kelp forests, counting all of the sea urchins and different animals and fish that are there, and then into the seagrass meadows where we might be taking sediment cores to look at the carbon that's stored in there. So I think what makes Port Phillip and Western Port Bay so unique is the diverse array of marine ecosystems. We have the kelp forests, we have the sponge gardens, mangroves and the salt marshes. If you want to go fishing for snapper, you go over here. If you want to see a beautiful bird, you go over to this other spot. So I think it's got a little bit of everything for everyone.
75% of Victoria's population live around the bays, so we use it for all sorts of things. We have people fishing, we have surfing, we have scuba divers, kids playing, we have everyone using the bay. State of the Bays report is a baseline study on the health of Port Phillip and Western Port Bay that's been brought together by government, working collaboratively with the science and broader community to bring together an understanding of what we know and tell us about what we need to know. We're here to take complex science and make sure we get the academic rigour that's required in independent science reporting, but also tell stories that are meaningful for a very diverse community. We looked at mangroves, we looked at salt marshes, we looked at reefs, fish, climate change impacts, temperature impacts, water quality, those sorts of things. We've been really fortunate that the bays are resilient and are healthy, but we can't take that for granted as we grow as a society. We really need to make sure we proactively manage the bays.
A healthy bay is really important. I mean, I want my kids to be able to enjoy what I've enjoyed ever since I was 4 years old. So to sustain the bay's health and to create a good fishery is just so important, I think, for future generations.
So the Victorian State of the Environment report is under preparation, and as I said, will be ready in November, and is actually in full draft now, but there's a lot of work to do. I won't go into too many synthesis and findings, but I'll just give you some updates and a few little sneak peeks. So this is for the really interested people, but these reports are quite difficult to read. I've just put there for people who really want to understand what's in there. We'll have the scope of indicators, assessments, knowledge gaps. So what do we know? The big bit for me is what do we know, what don't we know, what do we need to know? That's really important for policymakers. The current policy and management responses will be updated, and then we'll talk about the future indicators. Which ones do we need to carry forward for the state over the next decade? Which ones do we park? And what are the new ones related to the Sustainable Development Goals? Because if we're not comparing apples with apples over the next decade with a set of statewide indicators, which is what's happened in the past, they change, then that's a real problem if we want real reform. And we'll have recommendations. The Future Focus 2030 is the chapter that I think is really of most interest to, what do we need to do? Because I could imagine if I was the minister and someone brings me this big report And I'd say, well, okay, what do I need to do? What do you think we should focus on? What are the big issues that we need to deal with? So that we're actually synthesising them throughout the report, but we'll pull together a chapter that if you didn't read anything else, you read that, you'd have a pretty good idea of what we think the priority areas are. For, as Peter said, the interim report was released in July the 30th on our website. It's a full structure that it's really there for transparency, to make sure people are seeing what we're doing. Consultation, we've spoken about what we're doing using that, but it's also really put more rigour into the process of the actual report production, because we've really refined this report. We're very happy with how it's going. So this State of the Environment report is a stock take of the scientific baseline. In the same way the State of the Bays report was the first ever baseline report from government on the health of Port Phillip and Western Port. This State of the Environment will have the first baseline of what peer-reviewed science is around. I don't know if people realise, but as Commissioner, I don't commission science. I gather the information that's coming in from the agency, so Parks Victoria, EPA Victoria, DELP, all these different agencies, local government. So I can't report on it if we don't have it. So what I want to do is understand what's the actual baseline stock take, and then where are the gaps in areas that we should actually have more information coming in, and where aren't we gathering information. I put this one up just to show you that that's really about highlighting a different approach. The reason we've got 242 indicators in 2018 rather than 120 and 90 was because the previous reports were written with an idea that the commissioners wanted to talk about these things and bring these indicators together. This is more a, put it all together, what's the baseline? So it's a different approach. There's lots of different areas: air quality, biodiversity, coastal waters, land health, water quality, climate change. These will all be chapters. Fire, forests, water resources. The coast and marine is a new, because we're doing the marine and coast report in 2021 now, and we've got State of the Bays. That'll be quite an interesting one to do. We'll talk about energy. We'll talk about waste and resource recovery. I actually worked for 4 years in the waste business, so I'm particularly interested in that chapter and what we might need to do. Transport, obviously, and then Future Focus 2030. So they're the kind of themes and chapters. It's very logical. So I thought I'd just pick out a couple. I noticed in the advertisement that Mike put out that he said I'd talk about a couple of things, one of them being waste and something else, so I thought I'd better make sure I just drill down to some of them and don't leave the audience disappointed. I mean, you're all here for something, aren't you? So where will the 2018 report direct focus to improve air quality science? So that's where are we going to start? Where is our mind around the recommendations? Expanding Victoria's air monitoring network to include greater coverage across regional Victoria is really important. But also, actually, here in metropolitan Melbourne, if you actually walk out onto La Trobe Street and just up a little bit, there's a little weather air monitoring station that Andy, who worked on this with EPA, said that's the monitoring station for Melbourne. So I've just expanded our recommendation. Coordinating health data. There's a lot of this work already underway. Fantastic work done on the EPA inquiry to link air and health and environment. And Andrea Hindwood at EPA is doing some great work. So coordinating health is important, but there's plenty going on. And establishing a more dynamic air inventory for ambient air quality. So a few things about the science and gathering of science and monitoring. Investment in science. But as I said, there's a lot of work going on now after the EPA inquiry that should give everyone comfort that this is well underway, and we'll add a little bit to that. With biodiversity, which is so important, biodiversity is a really important indicator. As you know, a healthy biodiversity in the environment's important for our health. But biodiversity is both a lag indicator and a lead indicator. It's the canary in the coal mine. If the biodiversity is starting to diminish, that's telling us something and we need to be acting. So we'll be there'll be quite a lot of focus from us on the biodiversity chapter. And we've noticed that during the period of the bioplan being developed, which has been wonderful, there has been a shift in methodologies and less focus on the monitoring and more on the policy. And so there's the actual new data compared to 2013 is not as comprehensive as we would like it to be, and that will also inform some of our thinking. It's probably one of the areas where the most policy work's been done and the most impact, but perhaps less monitoring, wouldn't you say, Rebecca? Compared to what we'd like. And that links to threatened species as well. So I just put this up because when we talk about government policy, we're talking usually about public land. The white, which is about 60% of the state, is private land. The rest is public land in parks, forests and other Crown land. So there's that whole story about, well, we can do what we can do on public land, and then how do we activate biodiversity improvements, etc., on private land. So just thought that was an interesting fact you might like to know. So has anyone heard of Trust for Nature? Yeah, Trust for Nature is a small agency of government formed in 72 or something, 1972, and gets covenants over land, private land, to protect it, basically. We do the work and then we put it under covenant. It can get included in people's wills so that always remains. It's fantastic. But there's only about 0.3% of the private land estate under covenant. So 23.8 million hectares is Victoria's land mass, and there's only a small amount under covenant, 65. It's increasing and it's getting better, but these are areas, if you're thinking about what can I do to make a difference, there's a lot we can't do, but there's lots of ways we can. So looking at things like what's Trust for Nature doing and what's going on there, I think is really important when you look at how much of Victoria is private land. Water resources, there's so much work in the water space. In fact, I myself chair the Western Port Catchment's Integrated Water Management Plan to look at how we work across the waterway managers of government, so CMAs, water corps, local government, to get better integrated water management into planning new suburbs, use of recycled water, but really important in many other ways. Developing the framework for environmental water is Action 3.6. That's a comprehensive project, and we'll start setting out a method, but we certainly won't be measuring against that in the 2018 report. We need to understand the impact of a changing climate on stream flow, and we need to talk about stream flow monitoring and water monitoring and this type of stuff, and improving the mapping and monitoring of groundwater. So thinking about that, these are just some of the things that are coming to the fore when we're saying where can we really make a difference. So what keeps me awake at night is one of the big issues. I think it's one of the top 3 issues is stormwater. It's one of the reasons I chair the Western Port Catchment. Stormwater is the single biggest pollutant into the marine environment. 95% of the litter on beaches is coming from stormwater, and it's a huge cost, of course, if you don't manage it better and think about how you're going to build your suburbs and things for new suburbs and new development. That's one thing, but for the existing stock and what we're doing, it's a really big issue. The other really important thing about stormwater, when I think about the State of the Bays report that said, yes, 50 assessments of 36 indicators said that the ecological health of Port Phillip and Western Port is good, so that's good. There was 4 that weren't, but when we're measuring that against the State Environment Protection Policy Standard, so there's a standard, so how do we know it's good? Because we measure it against the standard, right? So if the standards change, and the new SEP's underway now, looking at how that standard might change, that we'll start to see that what we're doing, more of the same, will become increasingly difficult, which is such an important reason why the integrated water management work and looking at what we can do to collect stormwater is really important. So waste and resource recovery. One of the big issues, and before I was Commissioner, I chaired Sustainability Victoria, led a reform there and the waste policy planning reforms for Sustainability Victoria. So I'm probably very invested in this area. But we decided to set up the statewide Resource Recovery Infrastructure Plan, the SWIRP, and then subordinate plans around the state. So in other words, if we know what infrastructure we've got and we know where the waste is, we can work out what we need to do to make sure the waste keeps getting, used and recycled and things like that. So the ideas of the SWIRP was that it would help to drive a circular economy. But one of the issues is we haven't developed the monitoring framework and the collection of the data for a circular economy that sits with the SWIRP. So there's a really great opportunity to work with our colleagues to look at that through this cycle. Victoria has committed to a circular economy action plan by 2020, and so what we'll be doing is starting to look at places like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the European examples, to say what would be the indicators of a circular economy. And if you look at them, they include things like your exports, of course, your GDP, all sorts of things that are economic, community, as well as traditional things about waste to landfill. So we'll be part of the solution for what is currently underway now in response to the changes with China taking recycled waste. The other good thing is that what we're doing, there's sort of this opportunity now with the Feds working on stuff. So the the meeting of Environment Ministers of COAG in April this year, I put this up just in case there was someone who wanted to know what the Feds were doing. That's usually a question, what's happening nationally. But they have committed to things that are consistent with moving to a circular economy, encouraging waste reduction strategies, education, and increasing recycling. So the big thing there is if the federal government's committing to it and the state is well underway with it, what it means in a practical sense is we start to employ skills and people within government that are working on procurement, different ways of procuring recycled goods by government, using the procurement power of government. We look at markets for the recycled products. So government has a big role to play as an anchor tenant, if you like, in this space. And it's a really exciting space, and it's really good that Victoria is taking the lead, but also that there is a national agreement. So State of the Environment Report 2030 is not an arbitrary timeline. As I said, Future Focus 2030 is the one that's really, I'm passionate about saying, what do we do over the next decade? Let's look at that. But it also fits with the UN SDGs. They're to 2030. We've got the Paris targets, etc. There's a lot of reasons 2030 makes a lot of sense. But so, what does that all mean? What are we going to do? The areas of focus that we'll make recommendations, because we haven't even developed them, and I certainly wouldn't start talking about them, but there's sort of a couple of three things that I'm thinking are coming out through all the sections. It's either about building capability, so how do we do stuff? How do we get this system moving? What new skills do we need? What more investment do we need? Or is it the same investment on new things? And environmental economic accounting is a core area there, as well as data analytics. Governance is a really important area, which it sounds sort of simple, but it's really important. So if I look at the work we're doing on the state of the forest, for example, forests are governed by 32 acts. So just looking at some of this, just saying, okay, if I want to take things forward, move to solution, what would be the first thing I'd look at? And in some areas, reallocation of existing funds and accountabilities and governance is really important. And delivering what we've already said we do. So there's, as I said before, there's so many plans in place now, policies in place, and we spoke a lot about this today in our future resilience workshops. It's about delivery. It's about now doing a really good job adapting and having an adaptive approach, but really getting on with it. And what that means is thinking beyond our traditional methods. So as scientists, as I said, we used to write science reports talking to scientists. We're now doing things a bit differently and looking for outlook reporting and system change. And we need to be shifting from what we know to what we need to know, and recommending ways to government that says, let's do this more quickly. So in other words, trying to get some answers that shift us forward, don't just cycle around the same science problems. But we've got a lot the line up the top there just to symbolise there's a lot to work with. We have made huge investments in emergency management, incredible investments for things like the State Control Centre, use of big data. We're doing a lot of work on SDGs, the citizen science. We know how to communicate with citizens, and we know how for them to participate at one level. There's lots of things that we can bring together. How do we operationalise them and move them forward so that we can get things going more quickly as a community together? So it's not just government, it's all of us. We're working together. So my mission critical is that we need in the next decade to think operationally. Now we don't usually think operationally in policy land or science land. We think about the science or the policy. But if we think operationally, and as I said, there's lessons from elsewhere, we can actually get things moving. How does if people have worked in an operation, I worked for 20 years in operations, so I think operationally, someone said, what are you talking about? Gosh, you're off with the fairies. And I said to them, it's about the timeliness of decision making, isn't it? When you think operationally, you go, every day I need to gather evidence, look at what's going on, make a decision, are we on track? I'm not saying we do daily monitoring of things, but what I'm saying is get the information, make the decision, adapt if you need to. When you're running plant and equipment, you don't just keep running bad product because you've written a policy that says you won't come back for 3 years. You adapt. And so I'm thinking like that. I think the next decade is very much about us really starting to operationalise, use the great technologies we have at hand now, starting to invest in them, environmental economic accounts, and getting on with it. So my point is it's about leadership, it's about commitment, it's about action. Do you like the navel gazing? Do you think he's navel gazing? So if we implement the policies and plans we now have, let's focus on building capability. We've got some great plans and they're long-term, they're visionary, and we heard today our Climate Change Act is probably the best in the world and it accounts for 5 yearly adaptation plans. We've got it there. Let's get the information we need to move through. And we've got a lot of lessons in emergency management, which is kind of a sister in the DELT portfolio, it's sister, so we interface with that a lot. Invest in environmental economic accounting as a core skill in government. We can't just have economists, we must have environmental economic accountants. The UN has the system of environmental economic accounts, which is built off the UN's the system of accounts for accountants. This is about putting some economic value, some GDP value on what that bay's doing when it's cleaning up stuff. PDCA, governance. I suppose my last point is that there's a lot of changing in how we work and how we live our lives, but what's not changing is the importance or the holy grail of the work we do in our office, that privilege, that great opportunity to work for the Victorian community to create the scientific evidence base that will help take us forward, solve problems and protect the environment over the next decade for all Victorians and the environment. So thank you.